The incense still clings to her habit. Sister Lucia is 26 years old, and she can smell the myrrh and frankincense from the morning prayers, mixing with something else now smoke, and underneath the smoke, the copper salt tang of blood seeping through the cathedral stones. She was, until 3 hours ago, a bride of Christ at the convent of Santa Maria del Carmine, a woman who had taken vows at 16 and spent 10 years in contemplation, prayer, and the quiet work of illuminating manuscripts that the monastery sold to churches throughout the Italian peninsula. Now she crouches behind the altar of Otranto's cathedral, her white habit stained with soot and other things she does not want to examine, her hands pressed over the mouth of a girl barely 15, a novice who had been at the convent for only 6 months, to prevent her screaming from revealing their position to the soldiers she can hear moving through the nave. Through a gap between the altar and the wall, she can see what is happening. Ottoman soldiers are methodically working through the cathedral, pulling people from their hiding places, separating them into groups. The men are being bound and led outside, toward the hill that the people of Otranto call the Minerva. The women are being handled differently. The soldiers are examining them, evaluating, making assessments that Lucia recognizes from her father's livestock markets, the calculation of value that precedes sale. She was born Lucia Ferrante, daughter of a merchant who traded in wool and olive oil. She knows what commerce looks like. She knows what happens when human beings become merchandise. Outside, she can hear Archbishop Stefano Agricoli praying. His voice carries through the shattered doors of the cathedral, calm and clear, despite what must be happening to him. He is reciting the Credo, I believe, in one God, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, and she can hear other voices joining his. Hundreds of male voices raised in the profession of faith that will be their last words. Then the voice stops mid-phrase. She hears something that sounds like sawing. She hears the Archbishop scream, but only briefly, and then a sound she will carry with her for the rest of her life, the wet, heavy sound of something being torn apart. The novice beneath her hand convulses, trying to scream. Lucia presses harder, her own tears running silently down her cheeks, her lips moving in prayers she cannot voice. A soldier appears at the altar. He is young, perhaps 20, his face still bearing the softness of adolescence despite the hardness in his eyes. He looks at Lucia and the novice with an expression she cannot read. Not cruelty, exactly, but not mercy either. Assessment, calculation, the evaluation of property. These two, he calls in accented Italian, still young, undamaged. Other soldiers approach. Hands grab Lucia's arms, drag her from behind the altar, tear her habit as she struggles. The novice is similarly seized, her screams finally released as the hand that silenced her is pulled away. They are dragged through the cathedral, past the bodies of priests who tried to defend their flock, past the elderly and the children who have been deemed without value and left where they fell. They are taken through doors that once welcomed the faithful and now open onto a city that has become an abattoir. Otranto is burning. The smoke rises in columns that Lucia can see for miles, marking the destruction of everything she has known. The walls that protected the city for centuries are breached in 3 places. The streets are filled with soldiers moving in organized groups, some carrying plunder, some herding prisoners, some finishing the work of conquest in ways that make Lucia close her eyes and pray for blindness. But she cannot close her ears. She hears everything. The screams, the prayers, the orders shouted in Turkish, the begging in Italian that accomplishes nothing. She hears the sounds of a city dying, and she memorizes them because somewhere beneath her terror is the understanding that someone must survive to tell this story, that what is happening here must not be forgotten. She is a witness. She does not yet know that witnessing will become her purpose, that the testimony she will eventually give will help convince a pope that holy war was the only possible response to what the Ottomans did at Otranto. But that comes later. For now, she is dragged toward the harbor, toward the ships that will carry her away from everything she has ever known, toward a fate that the soldiers are already discussing in terms she is beginning to understand. Prize, property, pleasure. The words follow her through the streets of the burning city. What you are about to learn has been systematically excluded from the histories that celebrate the martyrs of Otranto. The 800 men who refused to convert to Islam and were beheaded on the Hill of Minerva are famous. They were canonized by Pope Francis in 2013, recognized as saints who chose death over apostasy, held up as examples of faith that refused to break under the most extreme pressure. Their story is told in churches, taught in schools, commemorated in monuments throughout southern Italy. But the story of what happened to the women, the wives, daughters, and sisters of those 800 men, and the nuns of the convents that dotted the city, that story has never been told publicly. The church that canonized the male martyrs has never acknowledged what happened to the female survivors, because the women's fate was considered shameful rather than holy. Tonight you will learn what the church has hidden for over 500 years. You will learn what Ottoman soldiers did to the women of Otranto in the days after the city fell. You will learn about the nuns of Santa Maria del Carmine, who were taken from their convent and subjected to treatment that the sources describe only in Latin, in documents that were sealed in Vatican archives for centuries. You will learn why the Ottoman commander Gedek Ahmed Pasha kept the women alive when he killed the men. You will learn about the slave ships that departed Otranto for markets in Albania and beyond. You will learn what survivors reported when they finally reached safety, and why their testimony convinced Pope Sixtus IV that crusade was the only appropriate response. You will learn about Sister Lucia Ferrante, whose account of the fall of Otranto survives in a single manuscript that the Church has never publicized. You will learn what she witnessed, what she endured, and how her testimony shaped the papal response to the Ottoman attack. Subscribe if you want to understand the full horror of what happened at Otranto in 1480. Comment below, telling me where you are watching from, because the 800 martyrs are only half the story. The other half, the half involving the women, is what truly made the Pope authorize holy war. But before I tell you what happened to Sister Lucia and the other women of Otranto, I need to take you back to July 1480, when Ottoman sails first appeared on the horizon, and the people of this small Italian city realized that the war they had heard about for decades had finally come to their shores. The Ottoman Empire in 1480 was the most powerful military force in the world. Sultan Mehmed II, who had conquered Constantinople 27 years earlier and ended the Byzantine Empire, had spent the intervening decades expanding Ottoman territory in every direction. Greece, Serbia, Albania, the Crimea, all had fallen to Ottoman armies that seemed unstoppable. The Mediterranean itself was becoming an Ottoman lake, with raids on Christian shipping growing more frequent and more devastating each year. Italy watched this expansion with growing terror. The Italian states Naples, the Papal States, Venice, Milan, Florence, were locked in their own petty conflicts, unable to unite against a threat that every informed observer understood was coming. Otranto, a small port city on the heel of the Italian boot, was one of the closest points to Ottoman territory in Albania, only 50 miles across the Adriatic. When the Ottoman fleet appeared on the 28th of July 1480, it carried approximately 18,000 soldiers under the command of Gedek Ahmed Pasha, one of Mehmed's most ruthless commanders. Ahmed Pasha had earned his reputation in campaigns across the Balkans, where his treatment of conquered populations had become legendary for its brutality. Otranto had a garrison of perhaps 400 soldiers and a civilian population of approximately 6,000. The walls were medieval, designed for an earlier era of warfare, inadequate against Ottoman siege techniques that had broken far stronger fortifications. Everyone in the city knew that relief from Naples might take weeks to arrive, if it came at all. The siege lasted 15 days. During those 15 days, the people of Otranto experienced what Ottoman military doctrine called softening, the systematic terrorization of a besieged population through bombardment, starvation, and the display of what would happen to those who resisted. Ottoman cannons shattered sections of the wall. Ottoman soldiers captured prisoners outside the walls and executed them in view of the defenders. Ottoman messengers offered terms: convert to Islam, surrender the city, accept Ottoman rule, or face the consequences. The city refused. The garrison fought. The civilian population, including the clergy, prepared for martyrdom if necessary. On August 11, the walls were breached in 3 places simultaneously. Ottoman soldiers poured into the city, and the killing began. Now let us return to Sister Lucia, who was in the convent of Santa Maria del Carmine when the walls fell. The convent stood near the eastern wall of Otranto, close enough that the sisters had heard every cannon shot during the 15-day siege, close enough that they had smelled the smoke from the fires that Ottoman bombardment had ignited in the civilian quarters. The Mother Superior, a woman of 60 named Sister Benedetta, had led them in constant prayer, rosary after rosary, mass after mass, preparation for whatever God intended for them. "We must accept God's will," Sister Benedetta had told them as the sounds of battle drew closer. "If martyrdom comes, we will embrace it. If life continues, we will serve as He directs. Fear is natural, but faith is stronger than fear." Lucia had believed this, had tried to believe it. But when the sounds of massacre reached the convent gates, when the screaming began and did not stop, when Ottoman soldiers began battering at the door that had never been designed to withstand military assault, she discovered that faith and fear could coexist in the same terrified heart. The door shattered. Soldiers poured into the courtyard where the sisters had gathered, 23 women in white habits, their ages ranging from 15 to 68, their faces showing every gradation of terror and resignation. Sister Benedetta stepped forward, her rosary raised, her voice strong. "We are brides of Christ," she said in Latin, then repeated it in Italian when the soldiers showed no understanding. "We are consecrated to God. We are not." The soldier's blade opened her throat before she could finish the sentence. She fell at the feet of the sisters who had followed her for decades, her blood spreading across the stones of the courtyard she had walked each morning in prayer. The soldiers moved through the remaining sisters with terrifying efficiency. The elderly were killed immediately. Sister Agnes, Sister Maria Grazia, Sister Tomasa, women who had spent 40 years in contemplation, disposed of in seconds because they had no value in the markets where survivors would be sold. The young were examined. Hands pulled at habits, assessed what lay beneath, made calculations that Lucia understood with sick clarity. She was young, healthy, her face unmarked by age or disease. She was valuable. She was allowed to live. 12 sisters survived the initial massacre. 12 women who would have chosen death with Sister Benedetta were denied that choice because their bodies had value that the soldiers intended to realize. They were bound with ropes that bit into wrists, accustomed to prayer beads. They were marched from the convent through streets where the massacre was still ongoing, past bodies of neighbors and parishioners, past scenes that Lucia forced herself to observe and memorize because she understood, even then, that testimony would matter. They were taken to the cathedral, where hundreds of other women had fled seeking sanctuary. The sanctuary had failed. The women were being sorted like livestock at market, separated by age and condition, prepared for transport to destinations that the soldiers discussed openly, knowing their captives could not understand Turkish. But one of the sisters could understand. Sister Elena, who had spent years in a Greek community that traded with Ottoman merchants, who had learned enough Turkish to follow basic conversations. She translated what she heard in whispered fragments, her voice steady despite the horror of what she was conveying. "They are taking the young women to Albania. There are markets there. Buyers who pay well for Italian women, especially those who are. She hesitated. Untouched. Brides of Christ. Virgins consecrated to God. Their very status made them more valuable in markets that prized what the soldiers would certainly take before any sale occurred. Lucia felt something shift inside her. The fear did not disappear, but it was joined by something harder, something that would sustain her through what was coming. Rage. The cold, steady rage of someone who intends to survive not despite what is being done to her, but because of it, who intends to carry the weight of witness through whatever darkness lies ahead. She would remember everything. She would survive. And she would tell the world what the Ottomans did at Otranto. The massacre of the men took place the following morning. The 800 who had become famous as martyrs were gathered on the hill of Minerva, outside the city walls, where the entire surviving population, including the women being held for transport, could witness what happened to those who refused to convert. Lucia watched from the harbor, bound with other women on the deck of a ship that was being loaded with plunder. She could see the hill clearly, could see the men kneeling in rows, could see the Ottoman executioners moving among them with blades that caught the morning sun. She recognized faces. Antonio Ferrante, her cousin, who had once brought her figs from his orchard before she took her vows. Marco the blacksmith, who had repaired the convent's gate hinges and refused payment because work for God's brides is work for God. Father Giovanni, the young priest, who had heard her confessions and offered wisdom that she had treasured. They were given a final chance to convert. One by one, a Turkish interpreter offered them life in exchange for faith. One by one, they refused. The killing took hours. 800 men, beheaded individually, their blood soaking into the hill until the earth itself seemed to run red. The executioners worked in shifts, resting when their arms grew tired, returning to continue the methodical destruction of everyone who had chosen death over apostasy. Archbishop Stefano Agricoli was killed differently. Lucia could not see the details from her position on the ship, but she could hear the sounds, the sawing, the screaming that went on far too long for a simple execution, the cheers of soldiers who were clearly enjoying what they witnessed. Later, she would learn that he had been sawed in half while still alive, that the sawing had begun at the groin and proceeded upward, that his death had taken nearly an hour. This was done, the soldiers said, because he was a bishop, because his rank required special treatment, because the Ottomans wanted the watching women to understand what would happen to anyone who resisted, to anyone who maintained faith in a God who had failed to protect his servants. The message was received. On the ship's deck, women who had been praying fell silent. Women who had been hoping for rescue understood that rescue would not come. Women who had been preparing for martyrdom realized that martyrdom was not being offered to them. Their fate was different. Worse, in some ways, because death would have been an ending, and they were being preserved for purposes that had no ending in sight. The ships departed Otranto that evening, carrying approximately 5,000 captives, mostly women and children, the men having been killed on the hill. They sailed east, toward Albania, toward markets that had been purchasing Italian captives for decades, toward futures that the women on deck could not imagine and did not want to. Lucia watched Otranto recede until it was nothing but smoke on the horizon, a smudge marking the place where her life had ended, even though her body continued to function. She memorized the direction of the smoke, the color of the sky, the faces of the soldiers who had killed everyone she knew. She would need these memories later. She would need them when testimony was required, when Pope Sixtus IV demanded to know exactly what had happened in the city that the Ottomans had destroyed. Now I need to tell you something about what happened on those ships, something that the Church has never officially acknowledged, but that the surviving testimony makes unmistakably clear. The women of Otranto were not simply transported from their city to the slave markets of Albania. The journey across the Adriatic, approximately 50 miles, requiring perhaps 12 to 18 hours of sailing, depending on winds, was itself part of their ordeal. Ottoman military doctrine distinguished between categories of captives. There were those destined for sale, who needed to be preserved in conditions suitable for market. There were those intended for distribution among soldiers as rewards for service, who could be used immediately. And there were those in-between women, who would be sold eventually, but who could be enjoyed during transport without significantly reducing their value. The nuns of Santa Maria del Carmine fell into this middle category. Their status as consecrated virgins made them valuable, yes, but there were 12 of them, more than any single buyer would want. Some would be sold intact. Others could be distributed among officers who had earned rewards through distinguished service during the siege. Commander Gedik Ahmed Pasha made the distribution personally. He selected 4 nuns for immediate use by his senior officers, the youngest, the most attractive, those whose terrors seemed to entertain the men who would receive them. The remaining 8, including Lucia, were designated for market, their condition to be preserved until sale could be arranged. But preserved did not mean protected. It meant only that the most obvious damage would be avoided. The officers who received the 4 selected nuns did not concern themselves with their market value, and what happened in those cabins during the crossing was audible throughout the ship, screaming that continued for hours. Then silence that was somehow worse. Lucia and the surviving nuns were kept on deck, bound to the rail, exposed to the elements and to the eyes of soldiers who walked past, commenting on what they would do if given the opportunity. They were given water, but no food. They were not permitted to move, to pray aloud, to speak to each other. They were being taught what they had become. When dawn broke over the Albanian coast, one of the 4 selected nuns was dead. Sister Elena, the one who had translated Turkish for the others, had somehow managed to throw herself over the rail during the night, drowning before anyone could retrieve her. The soldiers seemed annoyed by this waste of valuable property, but not surprised. It was, apparently, common for captives to attempt escape through death during transport. The remaining 3 were dragged onto the deck as the ship approached harbor. They could not walk without assistance. They could not speak coherently. Whatever had happened in those cabins had broken something in them that would never be repaired. Lucia looked at them and understood what had been intended for all of them. Understood that the only difference between herself and those 3 shattered women was the calculation of value that had designated her for market rather than immediate distribution. She added this understanding to the testimony she was building in her mind. She would need to tell the Pope not just what the Ottomans did, but what they intended. Not just the horror that occurred, but the system that produced it. The slave market at Vlore was where the women of Otranto were sorted for final sale. Vlore was an Ottoman port city that had served as a transit point for captives from across the Mediterranean for decades. The market infrastructure was well developed, holding pens, examination facilities, auction blocks, the entire apparatus of human commerce refined through years of operation. The buyers who frequented this market knew what they wanted, and knew how to evaluate merchandise. Lucia and the surviving nuns were processed through this system with efficiency that suggested long practice. They were stripped of their habits. The white cloth that had marked them as brides of Christ was valuable fabric that could be sold separately and given rough shifts that provided minimal coverage. They were examined by men who checked their teeth, their skin, their bodies, who confirmed the virginity that increased their value and noted the youth and health that would attract premium buyers. They were kept together, the 7 surviving nuns, in a holding cell with other Italian women from Otranto. Perhaps 60 women in total, crowded into a space designed for half that number, waiting for the auctions that would distribute them throughout Ottoman territory. During those days of waiting, Lucia gathered testimony. She spoke to every woman who would talk. She learned names, families, what they had witnessed, who had died, how they had been captured. She memorized everything because she had nothing to write with and nowhere to keep written records. She built a catalog of atrocity in her mind, organized by victim, by perpetrator, by location, by date. A woman named Giovanna told her about the cathedral, where Ottoman soldiers had cornered women seeking sanctuary and worked through them systematically for 3 days before the survivors were loaded onto ships. Giovanna's daughter, 12 years old, had been taken from her arms and given to a soldier who had particularly distinguished himself during the siege. A woman named Caterina told her about the archbishop's death, which she had witnessed from much closer than Lucia. The sawing had not been random brutality, it had been calculated to prolong suffering, with pauses when the archbishop seemed close to losing consciousness, with water thrown on his face to revive him for more. Caterina had been held in place, forced to watch as a lesson in what resistance produced. A woman named Beatrice told her about the convent of San Francesco, where elderly monks had been burned alive in their chapel while soldiers looted the treasury. The smoke had been visible from where the women were being held, and the screams had continued for longer than Beatrice could explain. Lucia recorded everything. Name after name, atrocity after atrocity, building a testimony that would eventually reach Rome and convince Pope Sixtus IV that the Ottoman threat required a military response that went beyond diplomacy and negotiation. The auction was held on the 5th day after their arrival. Lucia was sold to a merchant named Hamza al-Kotor, a trader who specialized in Italian captives and who recognized the particular value of educated women who could read and write. The price was 28 ducats higher than average for a woman of her age, reflecting her literacy and the cachet of her status as a former nun. Hamza was not cruel by the standards of the trade he practiced. He did not personally abuse the women he purchased. He simply bought them, held them, sold them onward to buyers whose purposes he did not investigate. He was a businessman dealing in merchandise that happened to be human. "You will serve in my household until a suitable buyer is found," he told Lucia in Italian, that suggested long experience with captives from her country. "You will work. You will obey. You will not attempt escape, because escape is impossible, and the punishment for attempting it is unpleasant for everyone involved." What work? Domestic service. Cleaning, cooking, whatever tasks need doing, I am not interested in. He paused, choosing words. Other uses. My wife is jealous, and my business depends on delivering merchandise in marketable condition. You will not be touched while under my ownership. This was, Lucia understood, mercy of a sort. The sort of mercy that came from commercial calculation rather than human compassion, but mercy nonetheless. She would be preserved, maintained, prepared for eventual sale to a buyer whose purposes Hamza would not investigate. She worked in his household for 11 months. During those months, she continued gathering testimony. Hamza's trading operation brought him into contact with captives from throughout the Mediterranean, not just Otranto, but Venetian territories, Greek islands, Italian coastal cities that Ottoman raiders had attacked. Lucia listened to everyone who passed through, memorized their stories, added their experiences to the catalog she was building. She learned about the market for Italian women, higher prices for virgins, premium rates for education and refinement, specific buyers who sought specific characteristics. She learned about the destination's Ottoman harems, wealthy households in Istanbul and beyond, brothels in port cities where sailors sought particular types of entertainment. She learned that she was fortunate. Many women from Otranto had already been sold to destinations from which no return was possible. The 3 shattered nuns from the ship had been purchased by a brothel owner in Thessaloniki. Other women had disappeared into households where no correspondence reached the outside world. But some had ended up in places where connections to the Christian world remained. A woman named Maria had been purchased by a Greek merchant whose wife had died, and she was permitted to write letters that occasionally reached Venice. A woman named Rosa had been acquired by a Turkish official who permitted her to attend Greek Orthodox services, where she made contact with priests who might carry messages westward. Through these tenuous connections, word of what had happened at Otranto began to reach Christian Europe. Fragments at first rumors of massacre, whispers of atrocities, but gradually coalescing into a picture that horrified everyone who heard it. Pope Sixtus IV received reports from multiple sources: merchants, diplomats, priests who had contact with Orthodox Christians in Ottoman territory. He learned about the 800 martyrs, whose deaths were being commemorated by captives who had witnessed the executions. He learned about the women whose fates were described in terms that the official records softened but that private correspondence made explicit. And he learned that the Ottomans were not finished. Gedik Ahmed Pasha's expedition to Otranto had been a test, a probe of Italian defenses that had revealed fatal weaknesses. More attacks were planned. The entire Italian peninsula was at risk. The Pope began planning his response. Lucia's opportunity for escape came 13 months after her capture, in September 1481. Sultan Mehmed II had died in May of that year, and the succession struggle between his sons had thrown the Ottoman military into disarray. Gedik Ahmed Pasha, the commander who had sacked Otranto, was recalled to deal with internal threats, and the garrison he had left in the city, yes, the Ottomans had held Otranto for over a year, was weakened and demoralized. A Neapolitan fleet arrived to retake the city. After a brief siege, the Ottoman garrison surrendered, and Otranto returned to Christian control. The liberation was celebrated throughout Italy, seen as proof that Ottoman expansion could be reversed. But for the captives already transported to Albania and beyond, the liberation of Otranto meant nothing. They were still property, still held in Ottoman territory, still waiting for buyers whose purposes they dreaded. Except that the chaos of succession created opportunities. Hamza al-Kotor's business suffered during the instability. Shipping was disrupted, markets were uncertain, and he found himself with more captives than he could maintain. He began selling at reduced prices, accepting whatever buyers offered, liquidating inventory to survive the disruption. Lucia was purchased by a Greek merchant named Nikolaos Papadopoulos, whose wife needed domestic help, and who specifically sought Italian women because of their reputation for cleanliness and education. Nikolaos was Orthodox Christian. His household included a chapel where services were held weekly. His trade connections reached Venice, whose ships passed regularly through the ports where he did business. Lucia saw her chance. "I am a nun," she told Nikolaos's wife, Maria, during her first week in the household. "I was captured at Otranto. I have testimony about what happened there. Testimony that the Pope needs to hear. If you help me reach Christian territory, the Church will reward you. And God will reward you in ways that transcend earthly compensation." Maria was skeptical. Many captives told stories, made promises, tried to manipulate their way to freedom, but Lucia was different. She was calm, precise, detailed in ways that suggested truth rather than desperation. "What testimony?" Lucia told her. "Not everything that would take hours, but enough. The massacre on the Hill of Minerva, the archbishop sawed in half, the women of the cathedral, the nuns of Santa Maria del Carmine, the ships, the markets, the systematic distribution of Christian women throughout Ottoman territory." Maria wept before Lucia finished. "My cousin was in Crete when the Ottomans came," she said. "She was taken. We never learned what happened to her, but I have imagined it. Every day for 15 years, I have imagined it. Help me reach Venice, and I will tell the Pope everything. I will ensure that what happened at Otranto and Crete, and everywhere the Ottomans have taken Christian women, becomes known throughout Christendom." Maria helped. The journey from Albania to Venice took 3 months, involving multiple ships, forged documents, bribes to customs officials, and the cooperation of a network of Orthodox and Catholic Christians who had built systems for moving people and information through Ottoman-controlled territory. Lucia traveled hidden in cargo holds, disguised as a merchant's wife, concealed among goods that were themselves a form of disguise. She moved from port to port, each transfer bringing her closer to safety, each night spent in hiding another test of her determination to survive and testify. She arrived in Venice in December 1481, nearly 18 months after her capture at Otranto. She was thin, exhausted, wearing clothes that bore no resemblance to the habit she had once treasured. But she was free, and she carried in her mind testimony that would change how Pope Sixtus IV understood the Ottoman threat. The Venetian authorities were initially skeptical. Many refugees arrived, claiming important information, seeking attention, hoping for support. But Lucia had details that could be verified: names of Ottoman commanders, descriptions of military operations, accounts of captives whose families were still searching for information. Her account was transcribed by a Venetian scribe, the first written record of testimony she had carried in memory for 18 months. The document was sent to Rome, where it joined other accounts that were accumulating in papal archives. Pope Sixtus IV read the testimony personally. He had already issued calls for crusade based on reports of the 800 martyrs, whose fate had become known throughout Christian Europe. But Lucia's testimony added something that the accounts of male martyrdom did not include: a systematic description of what happened to the women, the deliberate, calculated destruction of thousands of Christian wives, daughters, and consecrated virgins. The Pope's response was recorded in correspondence that survives in the Vatican archives. He was horrified not just by the martyrdoms, which were, in their way, holy deaths that the Church could celebrate, but by the fates of the women, which were ongoing, which continued every day in Ottoman households and markets and brothels throughout the territory the Sultan controlled. The crusade he called for was not only to avenge the martyrs, it was to rescue the living, to recover, if possible, the women who had been taken, and to prevent future attacks that would take more. Lucia did not stop testifying. She traveled to Rome, where she met with papal officials and repeated her account to scribes who recorded every detail. She met with representatives of other Italian states, sharing information about Ottoman military capabilities that she had gathered during her months in captivity. She became, gradually, one of the most important sources of intelligence about the Ottoman threat available to Christian Europe. She also searched for her sisters from the convent. Of the 7 nuns who had survived the initial sorting at Vlore, she had lost track of all but one Sister Magdalena, who had been purchased by a household in Thessaloniki, and who was eventually ransomed by relatives who paid an enormous sum to recover her. Magdalena's testimony confirmed and extended Lucia's account. Together, the 2 surviving nuns provided a picture of the Ottoman captive system that no male observer could have compiled, because no male observer had experienced what the women experienced. The 3 nuns who had been distributed to officers on the ship, Sister Clara, Sister Agata, and Sister Francesca, were never found. They had disappeared into a system that was designed to make people disappear, and despite years of searching, despite inquiries through every channel available, their fates remained unknown. Lucia added them to the list of martyrs that she compiled and submitted to papal authorities. Not the official martyrs, not the 800 who had chosen death over apostasy, but the other martyrs, the women who had been denied the opportunity for holy death and had been consumed by a horror that the Church did not know how to commemorate. She was, by this point, no longer a nun in any formal sense. Her vows had been made in a convent that no longer existed, to an order that had been destroyed. She wore secular clothing, lived in a small house provided by a Venetian family, grateful for intelligence she had provided about relatives who remained in Ottoman territory. But she continued the work she had begun in the holding cells of Vlore. She continued gathering testimony from other survivors, not just from Otranto, but from other Ottoman raids, other massacres, other ships full of women destined for markets and households and brothels throughout the Sultan's territory. She became a collector of horror, a compiler of atrocities, a woman whose purpose was to ensure that the fates of Christian women in Ottoman captivity would never be forgotten. The crusade that Pope Sixtus IV called for never materialized in the form he envisioned. The Italian states were too divided, too suspicious of each other, too focused on their own petty conflicts to unite against the Ottoman threat. Venice, which should have led any naval expedition to recover captives, was more interested in preserving its trading privileges in Ottoman ports than in provoking a war that might disrupt commerce. But the Pope's response had other effects. Financial support flowed to the Knights of St. John, who patrolled the Mediterranean and occasionally intercepted Ottoman ships carrying captives. Ransoming efforts were organized and funded, recovering some captives whose families could not afford the prices the Ottomans demanded. Defensive preparations were improved throughout the Italian peninsula, making future Otranto-style raids more difficult. And the testimony that Lucia and others had provided entered the historical record, ensuring that what happened at Otranto would not be forgotten, even as the immediate crisis faded. Lucia lived for another 43 years, dying in 1524 at the age of 70. She never returned to religious life, never took new vows, never rejoined the order that had been destroyed at Otranto. The woman who emerged from captivity was not the same as the nun who had crouched behind the altar of Otranto's cathedral, and she did not try to pretend otherwise. But she continued testifying until her death. She gave depositions, wrote letters, met with officials who were still trying to understand the Ottoman threat decades after Otranto. She maintained correspondence with other survivors, tracking what had happened to women she had known in the holding cells and markets, recording the fragmentary information that occasionally emerged about those who had disappeared. She also wrote her own account, not a formal testimony for official purposes, but a personal narrative of what she had experienced and witnessed. This account was copied by a scribe in 1512 and preserved in a monastery library in northern Italy, where it remained largely unexamined until modern scholars began researching the human dimensions of Ottoman expansion. The account is remarkable for its detail and its restraint. Lucia did not embellish or dramatize what she had experienced. She simply recorded it, in precise language that conveyed horror, through accumulation of fact rather than emotional manipulation. She described the massacre of the men, the seizure of the women, the distribution on the ships, the markets, the auctions, the household, where she served for 11 months. She described her escape, her testimony, her years of advocacy for other survivors. And she described what she had learned about the system that had consumed so many women from Otranto and elsewhere. The organization, the economics, the bureaucracy of captivity that made the Ottoman treatment of women not random brutality, but calculated destruction. The markets where virgins commanded premium prices. The households where educated women served purposes that combined domestic labor with other expectations. The brothels that absorbed women who had been used during transport and whose reduced value made them unsuitable for more respectable destinations. This was what had made the Pope authorize holy war, not just the 800 martyrs, whose deaths could be celebrated as holy sacrifice, but the thousands of women whose fates were too shameful for celebration but too horrific for silence. Remember the women of Otranto. Remember that when Ottoman forces conquered that city in 1480, they killed 800 men and captured 5,000 women. Remember that the men are famous martyrs, canonized by the Church, commemorated in monuments and holidays. Remember that the women are almost completely forgotten. Remember Sister Lucia Ferrante, who crouched behind an altar while her Mother Superior was murdered, who was stripped of her habit and sold in markets designed for exactly this purpose, who survived captivity and returned to testify about what she had witnessed. Remember that her testimony helped convince Pope Sixtus IV that crusade was necessary. Remember that the Pope was horrified, not just by the martyrdoms, but by the fates of the women, by the systematic destruction of Christian wives and daughters and nuns that continued every day in Ottoman territory. Remember that the Church has never commemorated the women. The 800 male martyrs have their saints' day, their shrine, their recognition. The 5,000 women have nothing because their fate was considered shameful, because survival in the circumstances they faced required accepting things that the Church could not acknowledge, because the victims of what the Ottomans did to women did not fit the narrative of heroic martyrdom that the Church wanted to celebrate. Remember that Lucia spent 43 years after her return gathering testimony from other survivors, tracking what happened to the women she had known in captivity, compiling a record of horror that the Church filed away and chose not to publicize. Remember Sister Clara, Sister Agata, and Sister Francesca, the 3 nuns distributed to Ottoman officers on the ship, whose screaming was audible throughout the crossing, whose fates remained unknown despite decades of searching. Remember the women of the cathedral who sought sanctuary in God's house and found that sanctuary could not protect them from men who recognized no law except force. Remember that what happened at Otranto was not unique. Ottoman raids had been taking Christian women for decades before 1480 and would continue for centuries afterward. The markets that processed the women of Otranto processed women from Crete and Cyprus and Venice and countless other places where Ottoman power reached. Remember that the history we inherit is shaped by what people chose to record and what they chose to suppress. The male martyrs of Otranto became famous because their deaths fit a narrative that the Church wanted to celebrate heroic sacrifice, faith unto death, the triumph of spirit over flesh. The female survivors of Otranto were suppressed because their experiences fit no narrative that the Church could embrace. Remember that testimony matters. Lucia survived not just physically, but purposefully, carrying in her mind the record of what she had witnessed, ensuring that the women of Otranto would not be completely forgotten, even though the Church preferred to forget them. Remember that what Ottoman soldiers did to the nuns of Otranto made the Pope authorize holy war, not the deaths of 800 men, however holy, but the ongoing horror of thousands of women, however shameful. Subscribe if you want more hidden histories revealed. Comment below telling me where you are watching from. Share this video with anyone who thinks they understand the martyrs of Otranto from the famous story of 800 men who chose death over apostasy. Because those 800 are only half the story. The other half, the half the Church has hidden for 500 years, is what truly revealed the Ottoman threat to Christian Europe. The martyrs died in a single day. The women suffered for years, decades, lifetimes in some cases. The martyrs were celebrated. The women were forgotten. Until now. Remember Sister Lucia Ferrante. Remember the nuns of Santa Maria del Carmine. Remember the women of Otranto. Remember what the Church has chosen to suppress. Remember